Strangely enough, dear friends, when I come to speak to you today, my thoughts begin, of all things, with professional wrestling. I am old enough to remember a time, and perhaps many of you are too, when suddenly we discovered that it wasn't real. You remember this? That there was a time when suddenly we found out, oh, it's all just a show. It's all organized. They've decided who the people are playing the different characters. They're the ones who are the good characters and the ones who are the bad characters. It turns out that, in fact, the whole thing was organized in that way with what they called heroes and heels in order to give people someone to cheer for and someone to hiss at, and in the process to generate even more revenue from it, I suppose. It's easy enough to see why that would work with the human spirit, because that's often what we do, isn't it? It's nice to be able to simplify the world into the good ones and the bad ones, the heroes and the villains. We do this all the time in different settings. I mean, I'm a big follower of mystery novels. Well, no matter how complicated the characters are in the mystery novel, there are those who are committing crimes and those who are trying to solve them. It's even more the case in superhero movies. Think of the last one you saw. Some characters are wearing primary colors, other ones are wearing shades of black and gray and white, and you can tell very clearly just by the way they look at what costume they have been put in, whether you're supposed to like them or not like them. It's even true with reality shows. You may know that those also are not real. The producers of reality shows have figured out that what they need to do is stir up conflict among the people who are on the show, because that turns out is good for ratings. And they've discovered that the people who are the biggest villains are the ones who get the best ratings, so there's also competition among the people on the show to see who can be the most awful person. That ought to make us stop and ponder our souls for a whole week, dear friends, but that's not exactly where I want to go. What I want to say is it does seem awfully easy to turn the world into those simple categories. To say, this is the one I'm cheering for, that's the one I'm not cheering for, or even worse, to say, well, at least I'm not that, whatever that is. For those who are regular readers of the Bible, that might bring up a memory of another parable that Jesus tells about the Pharisee and the tax collector who go into the temple to pray. The tax collector, who is not even able to look up to God, is praying, have mercy on me, over and over again. And the tax collector, who is supposed to be the person who has greater righteousness, who is saying, at least I'm not that guy. It ought to make us wonder a little what we're doing when we set these things up in our minds and in our lives, and what danger there might be when we begin to import them even into our spiritual lives. We should have particular care when we come upon lessons like the ones we heard this morning. The Old Testament, the Psalm, and the gospel lesson this morning all talk about the good and the wicked in one form or another. It's very tempting to say, well, I'm going to read this lesson and figure out which one I am. I'm not sure that's exactly what Jesus or any of the others who were writing these words or speaking these words intended for us to do. Taking the Beatitudes as a good example of this. First, I should say, you should be aware, I'm sure you are, that there are two versions of this story. The one we heard in Luke this morning and the ones in Matthew. The one in Matthew is probably better known because it has more categories. It has the more famous categories like blessed are the peacemakers, which we did not hear this morning. Matthew also softens and broadens the categories in a way. So we hear, blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. That's not what the writer of Luke is doing. The writer of Luke is punching us straight in the gut of humanity, saying, no, we're really talking about what you see going on around you with people you are not helping, the poor, the hungry, those who are oppressed by others. Now, no matter which of those categories which of those readings you choose, these are not really classes of being, ways of being that we should desire. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that if you want to be righteous, you better go make yourself hungry or poor or oppressed. So it would appear that the people who are in the good category, if you want to define it that way, are not necessarily people who chose to be there or who would choose to be there if they had any other option. Then Luke also gives us the woes. These are not in Matthew, they're only in the version from Luke. We're being told that there are people who presently have certain things that appear to be desirable who will be unhappy in one dimension or another in the future. If that's not something that we would wish for ourselves, why would we wish it for anyone else? Is it quite appropriate for us to be wishing those we don't like into pain, into loss, into death? So if in fact it's not as simple as it appears, what in the world is going on here? Surely it is the case that the oppressed, however we define it, are never entirely sinless. We as Christians recognize that every one of us is a sinner. It also seems to be the case that those who are in the oppressor category, the category of those who are looking at woe in the future, are not entirely bad. Is it ever the case that anybody is 100% evil? If neither of those is the case, it makes it much more difficult for us to begin to assign people to categories. There are problems of side-taking. Who gets to judge? Who's going to decide who is good and who is not when judgment has been put entirely in the hands of God? We read that right there in the words. There are problems of hypocrisy. Jesus says to his followers elsewhere, remove the log from your own eye before you remove the speck from someone else's. Now, we're all walking around with logs in our eyes. How well can we see what category anyone else belongs in? And then there are also problems of practical spirituality. If I do nothing else, if you should expect nothing else from me, every time I stand here and do this, it should be that there will be something we can take away and use in our own spiritual life, use in our own lives as faithful followers of Jesus. The question that comes to every preacher every Sunday is, how then shall we live? I have a couple of thoughts on that for you that we might meditate on this week. The first, and one that apparently I did not hit on adequately strongly at 8 o'clock, and so I will do so in no uncertain terms now, is to say that Jesus is being prophetic here. He is, in the sense that prophecy is speaking about the way the world is versus the way the world ought to be, if it were in line with God's desires, God's plan for the universe. So he's saying, these are the categories that I'm calling out. These are the people whose lives we fail to notice. Those who live among us who are poor and oppressed and hungry and lacking in anything and everything else. Once Jesus has named them, we can't unsee them. Once we have seen them, we must respond. Let there be no doubt, dear friends, this is not a lesson telling us that we should not call out oppression when we see it, or that we should not respond to need when we perceive it among our neighbors. If we fail to do that, then we have failed to do what we promised to do when we were baptized. Remember the words? Seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving our neighbors as ourselves. We have promised to do that. Nothing that Jesus says will lessen that any. So there is that here. We are being reminded once again that the needs of this world are close to the heart of God. And to fail to meet them is to fail to be fully the children God intends us to be. If that's all you need to hear today, then go and be blessed. But I think there's more, and it's actually harder than that. I think there is a challenge in this lesson to you and to me to change the way that we view ourselves and the way that we view others. Where I began was with us and them, heroes and villains. I I think if anything, this set of lessons is telling us that that simply is not good enough. There must be some other way that we see ourselves and we see others. It changes our view, our perspective. I think we find at least a hint of it in the lesson from Jeremiah this morning. You'll note that when Jeremiah is talking about the good and the wicked, the writer of Jeremiah is talking about those who depend on God and those who depend on humanity. Now, if humanity doesn't work for you there, you can take it out and plug in anything else. The distinction is between those who depend on God and those who depend on absolutely anything other than God. That's hard. The call to be completely dependent on God. It's harder than not killing, it's harder than not stealing, it's harder than not coveting, it's harder than all the other things that we're supposed to do and all things that we're not supposed to do. Because it's awfully easy to look around us and say, I've got this. I can handle this. My strength is enough. As far as I can tell, I'm going to have to rely on my own strength. What we're being told here is, what we're being shown by Jesus is that if we're going to depend on God entirely, we better look at those who are presently completely dependent on God. The poor, the hungry, those who have the least power, those who have the least voice. They've already got it. They are blessed, as it says, unlikely as that may seem to us in our view of the world, because they have already come to realize that their only help is going to come from God. And so God will, in fact, deliver them in God's time and in God's way. How blessed would we be if we could do the same? How much blessing are we leaving on the table by failing even to recognize that that is what God desires for us? So, dear friends, the choice is clear before us. It's heroes and villains or dependence on God. Not an easy choice necessarily as we walk through the days of our present life. Nonetheless, the one that leads to blessing. Amen.